You know that Trieste combines its literary and cultural tradition with the excellence of its science system. One of the definitions of Trieste is Trieste, the city of science. It was European Capital of Science in 2020. It is home to more than 30 research and higher education centers, in addition to its university, which has its 100th anniversary this year. And these institutions include CISA. CISA is the International School for Advanced Studies, which hosts a laboratory dedicated to the study of reading, language, and learning, combining cognitive and computational approaches. Now we're getting into something specific here. It will therefore be a unique opportunity to learn more about how valuable the activity of reading is for the development of our brains. So we will have a very interesting session, reading in the brain, followed by reading for the brain. Unfortunately, Stanislas Dehaene had to cancel his trip to Trieste. He will not be here with us physically, but he will be connecting through Zoom at 10:10. And we have Kate Nation and Lynn Murray already arrived with us, so please, big round of applause to our guests. And we have a real, live, cognitive neuroscientist from CISA, who has greatly contributed to the Congress Scientific Committee. So thank you, Davide Crepaldi, for what you've done. You have coordinated, he's coordinated all of the part of the, let's say, the science, together with Giorgio Tamburlini, who is the director of the center, help me? Salute Bambino. No, I know, I collaborate with you, but I'm confused between Italian and English, you know, the Center for the Health for the Child. And Giorgio also is not with us today because he had another commitment, but he moderated the sessions for those of you who were present on the first day. So thank you also, please, to Giorgio, his valuable colleague from Trieste. And we have Alessandra Sila, the director of CSB here. Now, the idea is we have about 20 minutes, and we have Davide with us. You might have tons of questions you wanted to ask a real scientist, you know. What are you doing? What does a neurocognitive scientist do? What is a lab you're directing doing? How many people are there? What the hell are you doing the whole day long? How do you explain to people those complicated things? Does it make any sense for us? You know, that kind of things, very informal, very community-like, like last night, the bus, you know? So Davide, would you be willing to be on stage? And there will be microphones around. Don't be shy. Any question can be asked. There's no stupid question, remember? My grandmother used to say, stupid is who never asks questions. So please contribute. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elisabetta, for the lovely introduction. And of course, thanks to IBBY and the organizing committee for involving me into this. It was a very great pleasure. And yeah, as a real scientist, I'll get to that in a second. I'm a little bit embarrassed by that label, and I'll tell you why in a second. But yeah, it's always very nice for me, and I think for us as an academic community to, you know, get a little bit outside of our usual backyard, right? And try to see how what we study, reading, is used in the real world, from librarians, from school teachers, from editorial editorial boards and companies and all of that. So it was a very, very enriching experience. But yeah, I'm a scientist. That's my job. So that's how I spend my day. And we were discussing a little bit with some of the organizers before the conference, and we realized that for some of you, that might sound a little bit mysterious, right? What does a reading scientist do all day? How do we keep us busy? And so we thought we could take advantage of these few minutes before I introduce Stanislas Dehaene, Kate Nation, and Lynn Murray on the stage, for you to ask me questions about that. So what do we do? Maybe I'll give you like a couple of sentences just to provide a very general description to break the ice a little bit. So essentially, studying reading from an experimental point of view essentially means, fairly banally, to put up experiments on reading, right? Which means creating some controlled reading situations of very different sorts. I'll get to that in a second, where we can actually then measure some behavior or neural variable that we believe it is of interest for some theoretical reason, and see how this varies as a consequence of other things that we varies. Okay, you can think about, I don't know, reading time, for example, as a function of how long a word is, or how frequently that word is used in a given context. I think that Kate, for example, will talk a little bit about that, showing us that for example, one big mistake I think that we always do is that we have this thing called word frequency, which represents, is an estimate of how frequent a word is in a language. And we typically have one number for each word, right? And this can work at some level. Like, of course, home is a little bit of a more frequent word than lice, right? But there are different contexts, and I think that every one of us experiences situations where in different situations in our lives, words can become much, much more frequent or much, much less frequent. In my family, I don't think I've ever used the word experiment, or very rarely, while I probably use this word like 100 of times when I'm at work. Or in different phases of life, right? As a child, of course, we use words very, very differently. That's exactly the topic Kate would talk to us about. So that's what we do. Okay, we set up situations where we measure things and we see how these things vary, if they vary, because sometimes they don't. We also have wrong theories occasionally. So, and experiments can mean anything, right? Can mean something extremely simple and intuitive, like putting a child, for example, in front of a computer and ask them to read words, and then, for example, we measure how they move their eyes, or just how much time they take to read a passage of text, to something a little bit more exotic, like putting up an artificial language, a language made up of symbols that are not letters that are familiar to the children. This is something that I do a lot, for example. I love doing this kind of experiments, especially to create the artificial lexicons in the first place. Typically, you know, you have a nice cover story, like this little alien was down to earth and now is trying to talk to us. Your task is to understand what this little green thing is telling us. And then we see how people respond to that. For example, we implement some of the statistics that we know are there in our real reading experience, right? Letter co-occurrence, for example. After reading a C, we know that it's very likely a vowel to come, for example, especially if you're Italian, right? And in general, it's much more likely to observe a K, for example, even if you're an English reader, than a T, or another word like, or another letter like that. We try to recreate the statistics in the alien language and see how children react to that. To the more fancy stuff, like using these machines, where we essentially measure how the brain is responding to that, independently of the behavior that goes with it. In some experiment, we don't even measure the behavior at all. We just measure what the brain is doing, like which area is lighting up. I'm sure that you've seen these fancy pictures now and there. Now, you shouldn't be fooled by the fact that these pictures are very fancy and colored and all that. Of course, there's lots of inference that goes on the top of that. So it's not really like you read the brain and you know what's going on. There's much more to do than that. But yeah, sometimes that's what we do. Okay, I think I spoke already too much, and I want to leave some time for questions. So I think that now it's your turn. Do you have any curiosity? Yep, there's a raised hand there. I don't know if Greta, yeah, there you go. A microphone is coming.
Thank you very much. In 2007, Marianne Wolf wrote The Proust and the Squid, which alerted us to this fact of brain activity, which in the past one always thought was very simple, and alerted, and also Baroness Grinfeld at Oxford, the multiplicity of activity in the brain for the reading. Have there been further developments on understanding how those synapses work and the difference between, say, playing a computer game?
Yeah. Very, very nice questions. Stanislas Dehaene will talk a lot about that, so I won't go too much into the details. But there's one important thing that I like to clarify, that when we measure neural activity, our spatial resolution, so the minimum amount of space that we can associate one number to, is very, very large compared to the size of a neuron or a synapse. To give you an idea, nowadays, the most powerful fMRI systems, Stan Dehaene has actually one just started in Paris, which goes a little bit beyond that, but the standard resolution is a cube of 1 millimeter per side, okay? That's thousands and thousands of neurons and tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of synapses. So anytime you see those things lighting up, we don't exactly know how precisely information is computed at the level where we know that it's most fundamentally computed, which is, as you say, the level of the individual cell. On that side, I would say that our understanding is still kind of facing a little bit of a wall. Of course, we understand a little bit better how neurons work in general, but it's always very, very difficult to associate this specifically with activities, like reading, for example, which we cannot ask animals to do, essentially. Because with animals, there are techniques that allows you to go a little bit more in depth, and in some cases even measure individual neurons. But with functional magnetic resonance, which is the standard measure that we use as human cognitive neuroscientists, you typically stay at a much, much broader level. So it's still very difficult to understand precisely what's going on. Yet, there are ways of using these machines that allows to address some of the questions. For example, the specificity of the activation in a given area as compared to another. And you refer very, very rightly to this understanding, to this little bit of insight that we had over the past, I would say maybe 20, 30 years as a cognitive neuroscientist, that the activity of the brain is very rarely like focalized in one given place. There's always a network involved. Maybe different parts of this networks are doing different things, but are doing those different things in a coordinated way. And especially for reading, this seems to be very important, because reading is a big, complex combination of fundamental cognitive endeavors, I would say, right? On the one hand, you need to visually recognize stuff using more or less the same mechanism that you use when you recognize an apple in the market. It's not so different. That's a part of the brain that is deputed to doing that. But then those symbols are very specific. And then you had to, gauge your understanding and knowledge of the symbols. For example, how the symbols go together, what I referred to very quickly before. And then, of course, there's a whole word that opens up once you recognize those scribbles as letters, right? Because then there's linguistic sounds that get activated. There's syntax, there's semantics. Sometimes most of the times, there's lots of implications about the social situations. This is irony, so I should laugh now. Oh, she's saying that, but she's not really meaning that. That's the message that I should get. And all of that, which is obviously shared with spoken language, and this opens up another very rich set of brain areas. So yeah, the network is very, 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 very large. Although there are some specific areas that now we've learned doing very specific, taking care of very specific aspects of this complex constellation of things. Yep, one there on the back.
Hello, thank you. Could you speak to a little bit about how children learn to read from a very early age? I'm thinking of the Scarborough's reading rope and the elements of reading.
Right.
One of the reasons that I ask is that I've been a lifelong school librarian, and the American Association of School Librarians have a position statement about not labeling books with reading levels. And I've seen with my own eyes how demotivating that can be to children's reading motivation. But as I've worked in the international aid arena over the last couple of years, I've seen a push from ministries of education and some international aid organizations to label books by reading level. And this seems to make no sense to me, because what I think I know about the decoding, the phonics, the word recognition element, and then all the other strands that contribute to fluent readers. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, and what publishers, how international publishers should respond when they are encouraged to place reading levels on their books. Could you speak to that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm afraid that's a little bit of a big question. How much time do we have? Now, jokes apart, first of all, Lynn and Kate are way more expert than me, so I'll leave that to them to address some of the points that you've made. From the literature, I know, yeah, there's lots of variability. Actually, I would try to probably make an even more general point, which is this idea of like within group versus between group variability. This is a little bit of a technical concept that we scientists and experimental psychologists use a lot. The idea is that we like to characterize stages of development, and when we do this, we unavoidably make up groups, right? So there is this stage, so children in this age band, for example, are doing this, children in this age band are doing that. And we characterize this in a very stark way, right? It's, speaking from my own experience, when I was in university, that was the way psychology worked, essentially, by grouping people into different profiles of some sort, even beyond the science of reading, of course. This happens a lot as in developmental psychology in many, many fields. I'm sure that Lynn has lots of stories about that. And this is fine, of course. There's nothing wrong with that. There are some qualitative differences between people, and those qualitative differences can be very, very important. But we should never forget that even within groups, there's lots of variability. You will always have, I think that, you know, I'm talking probably mostly to the teachers in the room, you will always experience like some fourth grader, which is way a better reader than some given fifth grader, for example. Some people that is particularly talented, some people that struggle particularly with some aspects of their development. So there's always gonna be this variability. So my general take would be that I don't know enough maybe to express like a strong feelings about labeling. The one thing I definitely can say though is that you should always accompany that with some awareness that you will always have an individual in front of you. And sometimes like even a book that has been, I don't know, labeled for like 10 years old can be perfect for a very, very, very talented and stimulated and gifted 5-year-old. It depends a lot on the kind of person you have in front of you and the kind of interest. I think the genre is very, very important here. There's some books that, of course, are very, very technical, but I don't know, speaking from my own experience, my young one is 5-year-old now, so he's not a reader yet, but he knows everything about mechanical machines. He knows way more terms than I know about how mechanical machines work and all of that. So there are books that would be completely inaccessible to me that would be perfect for him. So as long as we keep this in mind, I think we're fine. Okay, we still have 5 minutes, so if there's some other question, curiosity, even about the job itself, like for example, sometimes I ask myself how in my own activity I could try to, you know, contribute knowledge that is more directly applicable to the real world. I don't think that everything I do, for example, is particularly of that sort. Okay, I think there's a hand there. Was that a question? Yeah, the mic is coming. Wait a second, please. I also forgot to say, if some of you is a little bit more at her own or is on ease at speaking Italian, just do that and I'll translate the question for everyone, okay?
Hello, can you hear me? Oh yeah,
Yeah.
there we go. Hi, my name is Valerie. I'm from the US. And I have a question for you about the therapeutic response in reading and how that manifests in cognitive expression. As a scientist, what would that look like?
Say it again. I think I missed the initial part of the question.
In therapeutic response, so when kids are reading and they're kind of connecting with texts, what does that look like in cognitive science?
It depends a lot. As I said at the beginning, we measure many different aspects of the reading behavior and not just behavior, right? I'm including the brain too. By the way, I forgot to say that we put a cognitive neuroscience, a neuroscience term in the title of the question, but this doesn't necessarily mean that we're only speaking about the brain, right? This is another thing that it's very clear from the inside, but I realize that from the outside sometimes it's not obvious, right? How it's very difficult to talk about the brain without having the cognition, like the behavior, on the other hand, in our mind. So the two things, especially my own approach, but I'm quite sure that Professor Dehaene, Professor Nation, and Professor Murray would agree with me, you need the two sides of things together, right? This is related to your questions because, again, you can measure many, many different things. You can, for example, imagine that there's a given area in the brain that is not responding well enough or in the appropriate manner to reading, and this is what your therapeutic intervention is targeting, and that would be what you would be measuring in many different ways. Or some other times, probably more often, you focus on behavior and you have some target behavior that you think it's very, very relevant. And then I guess that the only trick there is quantification. As long as you can put a number on it in a way that is reliable, that's the other big thing, right? There's many, many tools. Some of them I know, some of them I've heard about. I know there's many, though, and I'm always surprised when I look a little bit into them how much they often lack of reliability measures. For example, if you test the same kid 1 month apart, how much the measure would remain stable. That's very difficult to do in experimental terms because, of course, for example, you should change the material that you have from one time to the other, and this is already prone to changing the behavior that ensue from that. So there's lots of, but experimental psychology has gone a long way in providing you with tools with that. So now that's one thing that you should definitely keep an eye on. But in general, what you measure really depends on your questions. It could be reading speed. For example, in a language like mine, like in Italian, where the phonological decoding is fairly easy because we have this nice one-to-one correspondence between graphemes and phonemes with very rare exceptions. Even dyslexic kids that are struggling a lot would typically be fairly accurate in their reading, but they're very slow. They're very serial in behavior. So that's one thing that is often targeted in this kind of intervention, and as a consequence, you would measure, for example, reading speed. Some other times it's qualitative phenomena. For example, how sensitive you are to morphology. I know that this is a big issue in learning to read, right? Especially in English, where knowing the morphological relationships between words helps you figuring out what is the right way to pronounce things. Or at even a more basic level, probably, to see semantic connections, right? Understanding that two words mean something similar. This is something that children don't always get for free. They need to be taught in a fairly explicit manner sometimes. So that's another thing that you could check. For example, you could have a passage of reading and you could measure how much the reading time or the time that your eyes stand on a given word depends on the frequency of the morphological stem, right? So if you have pharmacists, you measure the frequency of pharmacy as a stem of that word, and that typically matters in determining how much time you stay on that word. There are children that are very sensitive to that, some others that are not so sensitive, and in some theoretical traditions, the fact that people are not sensitive to morphology is indeed a problem. So you want to work on that, and in this case, you would measure sensitivity to this aspect of the reading behavior. I think we have time for one very short questions. Yeah, there's one here in the front row. Or maybe for a short answer, I should say, so I'll put the burden on myself. Sì, no problem.
Salve, grazie. Parlo in italiano, per me è più facile. Io sono una docente, insegno in una scuola secondaria di primo grado, l'ex scuola media, e ho letto quanto possa essere difficile anche dai libri di Dehaene, di Marianne Wolf, leggere. Però in classe è veramente tanto difficile. So quanto anche possa essere bello ed importante. Ho studiato anche questo. Cosa posso fare per rendere meno difficile la lettura in ragazzi che hanno 11, 12, 13 anni? Mm-hmm. Grazie.
Prego. So the question is about the difficulty of reading in a classroom environment. I guess that refers more or less to, maybe a difference between children, so some of them being very good, some of them not being very good, and maybe they don't want to be exposed too much. And to the general interest of reading, right, which is not like the most fancy activity for a 12 years old, I would say, or at least not for everyone. I'm not an expert in that, so I don't have like any easy, straightforward question, unfortunately. We can talk a little bit about that maybe later, because this will become a little bit a longer chat. In general, I think that this experience of sharing the reading in the class, you know, connecting to the sort of story that you're telling, if you choose the stories in an appropriate manner, for example, in a topic that you know is particularly popular in your class, doesn't matter, right? It could even be, I don't know, TV drama. TV drama is probably more from my times now. It should be something very popular on TikTok or something like that. Whatever it is, if you focus more on the content than on the process itself, that typically obviously makes things a little bit easier. But definitely I'm not an expert, so I would refer probably more to Lynn or Kate, or maybe we can just talk later on. But thanks for the question. That's obviously very, very appropriate, because it's always a little bit of a hurdle. And again, I'm experiencing that firsthand with my oldest one, which is exactly that age. And she doesn't particularly like reading, despite what her dad does for a living. So I'm always struggling to find ways to try to connect with her, but it's not very easy, unfortunately. Okay, prego. I think now it's time to move on to the real speakers of today, because of course my job in all that was essentially to put together the best possible set of speakers that will be able to give you an idea, a little bit of a snapshot of the current state of the art in the field of cognitive neuroscience and experimental psychology, and social psychology too, for what concerns the science of reading, okay? So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Stanislas Dehaene, who's connected from Zoom. Hi, Stan, very nice to see you. Thanks a lot for joining in. So Stan Dehaene is a professor at Collège de France, which is a very, very, very prestigious institution in France. Yeah, let's give a round of applause. And is one of the most notable figures in the cognitive neuroscience of reading. I would say probably the leader of the field for the last 15 to 20 years. Stanislas has made lots of contribution even to other fields of cognitive neuroscience, particularly numeracy. I would say that in general, his expertise is on those cognitive skills that are not biologically endowed, that are essentially cultural artifacts, which presents further challenges, of course, for cognitive neuroscience, because this essentially means that we're not, I'm simplifying things a little bit, but to make a nice headline, we're not born for doing that, for computing numbers and additions and subtractions and all of that, and reading, of course. So we had to use the cognitive portfolio that we have, that was, of course, developed during millennium of evolutions of our species, and put that to the service of one given specific cultural invention, in this case, reading. So Stanislas is going to talk to us about that and his latest discovery. So thanks a lot, Stan, and I'm leaving the stage to you.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me, in spite of the fact that I'm still in France. It's great to be with you today. Let me start to share my screen. I think it's this one. Yes. Let me know if you can hear me well enough, and I hope you can see the screen. I was asked to tell you a little bit about what we know about how reading gets inscribed into the brain as we learn to read. And my talk will be based on these two books. This one is a little bit older, Reading in the Brain, has a number of updates in this more recent book, How We Learn. And both are translated in Italian, by the way, if you prefer to read in Italian. I come from France, from this place just south of Paris, which is called Neurospin, where we have at our disposal a number of tools, essentially all of the available tools to study the brain at multiple scales. From human fMRI, we currently have the world's biggest MRI at 11.7 Tesla, just starting to work, to EEG, electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography, and even some animal work, to try to shed light on how the brain works, and in particular, how the brain learns new skills. And this aspect of learning was developed in particular with my wife, Ghislaine, who has managed to turn a lot of these tools into tools that are friendly to use with babies and young children. And we'll show you a few images of that. We are able to image the child's brain as it is being transformed by acquiring language and by acquiring reading. So I want to give you a little panorama of what changes in the brain when we learn to read, and in the conclusions to tell you a little bit about what this means for dyslexia and what it means for acquiring reading in every child. Here is one thing that we've discovered, that when it comes to spoken language, this is a very natural skill, something that the child very, very early on, the baby, will be acquiring very fast, using very stereotypes and probably pre-wired circuits. So you can see here the result of one experiment we did some time ago. We did several of these, where a little baby is listening to sentences in his mother tongue. And you can already see that the left hemisphere, left areas, areas of the temporal lobe, areas of the inferior frontal gyrus, which corresponds to Broca's area, are already being activated by this stimulus. Of course, the baby doesn't understand what he's hearing. He still has to learn the grammar and the meaning, but the signal, the speech signal, is being channeled to a specific circuit, and this will allow the child to very, very quickly acquire, in the space of 1 or 2 or 3 years, the parameters of the mother tongue, and to bring that to reading. So spoken language is very particular. It is pre-biased in a certain way by the evolution of our species. And in all of us, once we've learned to read, we reuse the areas of spoken language, which you can see on top here, for reading, which you can see in the bottom here. This is a beautiful image, not from my lab, but from the lab of Jack Gallant in California. And the colors that you see correspond to different domains of meaning. For instance, if you think about social or people, social sphere, the personal sphere, if you are thinking about numbers and so on, all of the different colors correspond to different aspects of meaning. But the point of this slide is to show you that once you've learned to read, you activate very much the same systems from reading and from spoken language. You're going to have a convergence. You're going to reuse all that you know about spoken language to understand what you read. Of course, that doesn't come so easily, and that's exactly when reading acquisition comes into play. We start in life with a very well-organized spoken language network with phonology, lexicon, syntax, meaning. That's all in place by about 3 years of life, and of course it will continue to grow, but it predates the acquisition of reading. What we have to do when we learn to read is to create a new interface into this system, an interface through vision, an artificial modality of language input, which is an invention, basically a recent invention in the life of humans. We use our visual cortex, but in particular, we use an area that I've called the brain's letterbox, the visual word form area, which is a specific site of the brain that gathers the information about letters, recognizes letter strings, and dispatches it to the language cortex, and in particular dispatches it to the phonemic representation in the planum temporale and nearby temporal lobe areas that allows us to decode written words. So this is the main transformation that we need to make occur in the brain of young children, a new input into the language system. So how have we discovered this? Well, we started to study what changes in the brain when we learn to read. What happens when you move from just treating this as little marks on stone or on paper to being able to read what's in them. We did that by studying illiterate people. And what you see here is the result of big studies where we compare for about 60 people who were completely illiterate, didn't have the chance to go to school, and people who were like you and I, high-level literates who could read more than 100 words per minute. And we have the whole scale here of reading abilities from 0, complete illiteracy, to more than 100 words per minute. And we correlated that with brain activity in response to written words. And so what you can see here is the areas in color are the ones that get more activated because you've learned to read. The more active they are, the more you can learn to read. And the first thing that you can see is that reading gives access, as I said, to all of the spoken language areas of the left hemisphere. In the temporal lobe, in Broca's area, you see more and more activation as you're able to read. But what makes this possible is the changes in the visual areas of the brain, which you see in the bottom here, especially in the left hemisphere. You have these changes in what is generally known as the visual word form area that has more and more activation as you are a better reader. And that will also include some activation in people who learn to read a little bit later in life. To anticipate, it's much easier to read early as a young child because the brain is more plastic. But if you learn later in life, you will have some activation in the same system. Surprisingly, we also found that reading changes the activation of spoken language area. So now we're talking about spoken sentences, spoken words, spoken pseudo words, but the fact that you've learned to read almost doubles the activation in these areas to spoken language. And we think that has to do with phonological awareness. As you develop reading, you become more aware of the organization of sounds in your language. You develop the ability to manipulate these sounds consciously, and we see this increase in activation here. We also saw that reading reinforces the connections between the two systems, and so that's completely compatible with what I just showed you, a connection between vision and phonology. In particular, I want to tell you about this area which plays a key role in the interface, the visual word form area, the brain's letterbox. We know a lot about this region now. All of you in this room who have learned to read, you have this area, which is always located at about the same site. Whenever people read, regardless of their culture, regardless of the writing system, it will respond, of course, to written words more than to other stimuli. You can see, for instance, here its response in intracranial recordings just to letter strings and words and pseudo words, but not to any other visual stimulus, not even numbers, mind you, right? Numbers are channeled to a slightly separate circuit. This is really a system about the alphabet. Right? But of course, it activates because we've learned, and so it will only activate to known scripts. If you've not learned Hebrew, it will not activate to Hebrew, or to Chinese if you've not learned Chinese. And if you have a lesion in the site, you will totally lose the ability to read. It is called pure alexia. It's been discovered more than 100 years ago now, and we can replicate it. This is really a site which is causally associated with the ability to read. If you lose it, you lose the ability to read. It is completely unconscious. What it does is compute the identity of strings of letters and allows you to, in a split of a second, recognize what it is without thinking. Thanks to our new tools, new fMRI, we can now zoom in this area. Davide was kind enough to mention that we can now achieve resolutions of about 1 millimeter. It's 1.2 millimeters here in the brain. So we're seeing in some detail what's happening when people read. And here we presented a whole array of different stimuli that have all 6 letters, but you can see that some are real words in English or in French. This is a bilingual French-English person. And some depart more and more from real English words or French words until they really don't have the right statistics, right? They are all infrequent letters. They might be a word in Polish, perhaps, but not in French or in English. And what we see here is that in a single person, now we can do these images one person at a time. You can see that what we used to think as the visual word form area, this region here, what we thought as a star is a galaxy, if you like. If we zoom in, we can see that it's little patches of cortex that are involved, that are all super specialized for reading. And they all care about the statistics of reading. In the back of the brain, this is the early visual cortex. There is no caring for the particular statistics because that's just a cortex that serves for any visual process. But as we move to the front, you can see these patches of cortex becoming more and more specialized for the language that you can read and for the statistics of the letters in the language you can read. And so these areas provide you with a very fast encoding of what are the letters, what are their positions, what are their relations to other letters. We can do this sort of work in young children. We've been doing that for a number of years now. We can present them words and faces and houses and checkerboards. And again, we see that in children who have learned to read, like in these 9-year-olds here, we see a patch of cortex that responds to written words. And we don't see this in younger children who have not learned to read. But it's not really a matter of age, because if we take 6 years old, slightly older, who have learned to read, and in France, typically you learn to read in about 1 year, in the first year of school, you can see this patch of cortex is already becoming quite apparent. We see these changes in the average here, but we've been able to do it with more children recently with this work with Xiaoxia Feng in collaboration with other people. We've been able to collect more statistics so that we were able to have a group of pre-readers, quite young people who could not yet read, and you can see there is no visual word form activation in the left hemisphere here. no green area if you like, but also very beginning readers were just about as young, around the age of 6, but had begun to learn to read, perhaps in their families, perhaps in preschool. You know that some children can be more precocious than others. And here we can see already the emergence of the visual word form area. And of course, it gets bigger and bigger in more advanced readers. So this allowed us to do something nice, to separate the variables of age and the variable of how well you can read. And we can see that the impact for this area is not age. Age is not the relevant variable. The relevant variable is how well you read, how much reading you've done. So this answers to some extent the question, can you read earlier than the normal age of first grade? Yes, you can. And if you do, you still will activate the very same circuitry. What depends for what matters for this area is really the experience of learning to read, regardless of the particular age. We see the contrary for face responses. So it's quite interesting that face responses depend on age and not reading education. They develop slowly as we get exposed to more and more faces. But in the case of reading, what we do is we take these children and we bombard them with reading experience, typically at the beginning of first grade, but some families do it earlier. We manipulate the statistics. We bombard the brains with this new task of learning to recognize letter strings, and they learn it quite fast. How fast they can do it, we were able to do with a longitudinal study a few years ago. We got the permission, which is quite exceptional, I think. It's still a unique study in the world. We got permission to scan 10 children repeatedly every 2 months so that we could track what happens before they enter school. And we got 4 scans all along the first school year when they learn to read, and 1 more year later. And so you can see each of these 10 children here, how well they develop grapheme-phoneme relationships and how well they develop fluency, the number of words they could read per minute. Both of these curves increase quite sharply. We selected children who had not learned to read before school. So this is 0.0 here is when they enter school. And you can see that school is doing its job of teaching grapheme-phoneme relationship, and they become more and more fluent with some differences between children. What we could see is that as soon as they begin to enter school and begin to learn to read, we see this circuit kicking in, which, if I zoom in a little bit, includes our visual word form area here. It appears exactly at the right site, it's immediately at the right position, and it will develop and develop as a function of reading experience together with other areas of the temporal lobe here. So we can say with quite certainty that this is one of the most important events in the acquisition of reading. Very, very early, in just a few weeks of starting to learn to read, children will develop responsivity in this side, the visual word form area. Again, it's quite different for faces. Here on the right, you see the response to faces, which is already present before entering school, especially in the right hemisphere here, and will develop slowly as a function of age. It's almost invisible here, the development, because it's a slow development. But with reading, we really kick in a new stimulus, letter strings. So this is a view of what might be happening. Before schooling, we already have some patches of cortex that like faces, that like houses, that like tools, and so on. We are, as young children, are quite good at visual recognition, but there are still some patches of cortex that are learning, that are labile, that are able to change. And when we learn to read, we specialize some of these patches of cortex for words. If we didn't do that, we would have cortex that would be invaded by the other categories, such as tools and faces. And so when we scan an illiterate subject, we see that the very same region will not stay silent, but will become specialized for faces and for tools. But because we learn to read, we get this specialization. And even more recently, this is getting a little bit more tactical, but I just want to tell you about this very recent work where we simulate the acquisition of reading in artificial neural networks, in artificial intelligence. You know that there are these nice networks that are developed to simulate the visual system. They have a little bit the architecture of the human visual system, but they're able to take an image as input and recognize what is the category. For instance, this is a dog, okay? So we take exactly this system and we recycle it, we retrain it, much like the human brain, to recognize words. So we give it more outputs for 1,000 words, and we give it word inputs, which are pictures of words, pictures of letter strings. And when we do that, we find that very much like the brain, this system will develop units, here about 33 units, that are just tuned to letters and to words, and they don't respond to faces and bodies and houses and tools and so on. They're very specialized, just like in the human brain. And what's wonderful now is we can analyze what are these units doing, and we understand the code, the neural code for learning to read. In this network model, at least, we see that there are units that appear that like to respond to a specific letter. For instance, just the letter A and no other letter. And not just that, but the letter A on the left side of the word and not on the right side of the word. As a result of the development of many such units for A, for R, and so on, each word begins to have a sort of sparse neural barcode. Each word can be represented by a small set of active neurons within those 33 units that gives it a unique identity, a unique barcode like this. And different words, even if they are slightly different, will have slightly different barcodes. And we can explain in this way the sort of errors that subject will make. So now we have a very clear hypothesis, a very clear model for what might be happening in the visual word form area. When we learn to read, we develop neurons that are tuned to particular letters at particular positions. We are just testing this model now. We have evidence that these neurons actually exist in the human brain. But I won't talk about that. It's too early to talk about that. Just to give you a little hint that we can go beyond just having voxels, having little circuits, to trying to understand at the single neuron level what's being done by the tissue of the brain, if you like. This is really the forefront of research now. Now, what happens in children who struggle with reading when they cannot quite read? Well, we also did the very same sort of images, presenting in fMRI words, faces, houses, checkers to people who could not read but have the same age as young readers, so 9-year-old dyslexics. And you can see here, the visual word form area is not developing properly. It's not being activated to the right level. So that's a very strong marker of not learning to read. And at the same time, you can also see that the face system is not quite well organized. And we're seeing that the face system is not developing normally. It's normally developing in the right hemisphere, and here it's not activated enough in dyslexic children. So in many of these children, we see anomalies in the development of the visual areas of the brain that should be specializing and reorganizing in order to acquire recognition of words. I should stress that this is perhaps a cause of dyslexia, but it could just as well be a consequence of dyslexia. It's very hard to tease apart the causes and the consequences. We just see a biomarker, something which is not normal in the brain of these children who are struggling to learn to read. But we can't really tell what is the cause and what is the consequence. But what we are pretty sure is that it's a very good biomarker, because now we've done these studies multiple times, and other people have done it as well. And in collaboration with Xiao Feng, we're also able to do that in Chinese dyslexics. And we compared Chinese dyslexia with French dyslexia, and we found that it's very much the same sort of localization of the abnormal activation. You can see this reduced activation in the French dyslexic here. It should be strongly responsive to words, and it's not. And very much the same was happening in the Chinese dyslexics here. To such an extent that the reduced activation was essentially the same in both France and China. And I don't want to give you the impression that it's just one area. There are many areas that are hypoactivated, that have a reduced activation in dyslexia compared to normal readers. You can see some of them here in the superior temporal sulcus, in the precentral gyrus. The whole circuit doesn't seem to be functioning normally, which is an indication that perhaps there are multiple types of dyslexias, because there are all sorts of different places where the circuit might dysfunction and the whole thing may collapse together. But the whole point here is that there is very little difference across cultures. We have a very precise circuit which has the right wiring in order to get recycled to acquire the recognition of the strings of letters, and we all use the same circuit. So I don't want to say a word about dyslexias in the plural, because if you see the complexity of this circuit, which is involved in visual recognition, extracting letter strings, going to the phonemic level, going to the lexical, syntactic and meaning level, these functions can occur at all sorts of places. And for a long time, it was thought that this was dominated by phonology, that there would be an impairment in phonological representation. So I think that's true to a large extent, but we should not underestimate the possibility that there are also impairments at other levels, and in particular, this very crucial level of visual recognition of letter strings. The visual code for letter may not be normal in many of these children. And recently, with a collaboration with Nama Friedman and Cassandra Potier-Watkins, we have discovered that in France, we can find at least 2 subtypes of visual dyslexias. One is letter position dyslexia, where the kids have not the right level of precision in the neural code for visual letters and their positions. So for instance, they might read the word form as from. They switch letters, right, inside the words. And remarkably, once we have the proper diagnostics, by having them read words where they can make this sort of error, we find that we can help them. How to help them? We can space the letters, which has been reported by others, and we might also just have them track with their finger the letters one after the other. This is very helpful for this sort of dyslexia because it helps them separate the positions of the letters and they become better readers. Completely different type of visual dyslexia is called attentional dyslexia. It's a little bit of a misnomer, but you'll get the idea in a second. What happens is that when you read, you really have to focus on one word at a time and not get distracted by all of the other letters on the page. And this is the problem for these children. You make them read form pale, and they might say farm pole. So what's happening here? They are borrowing a letter from the next word into the current word. And remarkably, they do so at the proper position. So position is correct, completely different from here. Position is correct, but they are borrowing letters from another word. And that's why it's called attentional, even though these children have normal visual attention for other categories, but for reading, they are not able to select just one object with their attention. They are getting distracted, if you want, by other words. So completely different type of dyslexia. And again, once we know it, we can help them by giving them a little window, just cut a piece of cardboard and make them slide it over the page so they only see one word at a time and they become quite normal readers. So this is not stable science yet. I think we're still struggling to understand the different subtypes of dyslexias. And that's why our brain images are still very murky, because we see the whole circuit being unactivated. We're still learning what are the different subtypes of dyslexias, but it seems that there might be different stages at which difficulties may occur. This leads me naturally to the conclusion of my talk, and I want to say a few words about how we should teach reading. You've seen the very particular circuit that is being taught by reading, by learning to read in every culture. So it's very clear that learning to read has nothing to do with hieroglyphics, right? It's not that individual children have to discover one after the other by themselves what happens in reading. Is that we have to teach them explicit phonics. We have to teach them how this circuit works from letters to sound, how to convert letters into sounds. I want to emphasize once again the completely different timelines for spoken language versus reading acquisition. This is spoken language. I've shown you that it starts extremely early, in the first days of life. In the first months of life, we already are learning spoken language. And there is a very slow growth of about 10 words per day to get to this highly organized adult network. Learning to read is completely different. It's a sudden spurt. At around the time of school, suddenly we feed the system with this written organization. We explain to children the correspondences between letters and sounds, and they can very, very quickly develop this circuit to get this alternative visual input into the spoken language system. And this is very important because after that, many new words and sentence structures are acquired through reading, not through spoken language. Reading plays a key role in continuing to organize the spoken language system. It's important to understand that comprehension is common between spoken language and written language. So we have to learn to decode from letters to sounds, and then there will be the development of comprehension common to spoken language and to written language. Okay, so this is our key role here as teachers. We want children to acquire very quickly the understanding of the code for written language. And how do we do this? I try to summarize this in little books, this one is available in French and in Spanish, unfortunately neither in Italian nor English, but maybe this could still help a little bit. There are many such syntheses in the literature. What should we teach? Here there is a lot of psychology, not so much neuroscience, but just pure psychology and studies in education that converge to say we need explicit teaching of grapheme-phoneme conversion rules or phonics. We need a systematic progression. We start with the simplest letters and the simplest letter to sound correspondences, and then we can progress through more complex ones. We need a very careful guidance of attention from left to right. We need to explicitly tell children that the words go from left to right and that the space of the written word corresponds to the time of the spoken word. This is, if you think about it, it's quite a very abstract knowledge that children are acquiring. The space of the written word corresponds to the time of the spoken word. So it's not trivial. They need to be told about that. That's a key of the alphabet. We know that they benefit from learning to read and to write at the same time. This is quite beneficial. And I would like to emphasize that they need to automatize. It's not enough to know the rules of grapheme-phoneme conversion. It needs to become completely automatic to help with this more direct route, recognizing the whole letter string and go to the lexicon. Let me show you how this works at the brain level, because we were able to get images of that. I showed you how when you enter school, you suddenly get this network activated, which includes the visual word form area, but also these additional parietal and frontal areas that have to do with attention and working memory and effort to decode the word. And this corresponds to the fact that in first grade, typically, the readers are letter by letter readers. Their reading time is not constant, but it takes more and more time to read longer and longer words, even from 2 to 5 letters here. And dyslexics may also be like that. They are slow readers. And what you absolutely want is to go to this second stage, which we were able to image 1 year later in these young children, where you see the activation as strongly reduced and concentrated in a few areas. You no longer need the activation of parietal and frontal areas. And in behavior, what happens is that reading time has become completely flat, independent of the number of letters. This is not whole word reading, it's letter reading, but parallel letter processing. Instead of going serially one letter at a time, all of the letters are processed at the same time. This is automaticity. This is automatized reading. That's the desired state of affairs here. Concentration of the knowledge in a small circuit, which is extremely efficient and unconscious. So we need to practice reading in order to move from effortful reading to automatized reading. I conclude by saying that since 6 years now, I helped found the Scientific Council for Education in France, a group of scientists, we are now 30 scientists of all disciplines who advise on education, review the evidence and so on. And we published several reviews for teachers, trainers, authors, and publishers, especially on reading. We publish guidelines on what every first grade teacher should know about the science of reading, and that's available in English here, as well as in French, of course. And we also publish recommendations on what are the manuals that work best. In fact, recently we managed to convince the Ministry of Education that the teaching manuals should be labeled according to how well they agree with the science of reading. So we are working together to define the proper criteria for what's a good reading manual. But I want to give you an idea of the French situation. This is a small sample of the manuals that are available in France. It's crazy. There's a large number of manuals that are available, and some of them are terrible, and some of them are better than others. And we helped to test what works best, and first of all, to understand what French teachers use. So you can see here the percentages of use in a huge inquiry of more than 10,000 teachers were asked, what manuals do you use? They mostly use these manuals here, which in fact are using mixed or balanced reading. And many teachers declared that they believe that children must rote memorize sight words. You can see the percentage of teachers who are using sight words, and many of them use something between 10 and 30 or even more than 40 sight words that you just have to learn by rote. And we just saw that this is not the way the brain works. The brain dissects the letter string into letters and maps them onto sounds. So there is a very small minority of teachers which uses just the purely phonics manual, which are down here, some of them at least. We wondered whether we could get evidence for that. And Jérôme Dovio and Paul Gioia performed a massive study of how the first graders progress as a function of what is the teaching method, not just the manual, but also what teachers declare that they do in the classroom. And you can see the large numbers of teachers here, and 130,000 children participated in this study through national statistics. So what is the conclusion? In 1 second, these manuals are doing better, significantly better. Strict phonics, which is 100% decipherable without sight words, systematically produces better results. And we're not talking about small results. We're talking about something like 5 words more per minute reading, especially for children who are struggling to learn to read, children who are not from the most privileged families. What happens is that the privileged families, if they see that the child is not learning, they compensate. They buy the manuals, they get the grandmother manual, and so on and so forth. So it's the poor children who are suffering from a poor education method. And that's what we found here, that the difference is really massive for children who are from low socioeconomic status families. After 4 months, they already read 5 words more per minute if they have been told with the proper method. And there is no need for sight words. This idea that you need sight words is just plain wrong. You need to train this circuit which has the knowledge of how letters corresponding to sound, and the best way to do that is phonics. So I'll just mention in passing that in the lab, we are also developing our own method. We put into software and also in little manuals now everything that we think we know about the science of reading. And this is working quite beautifully. It's a project led by Cassandra Potier-Watkins. It's going into several hundreds of French classrooms now, and also in Brazil and in Uruguay. We're trying to make it available more broadly. I think the science of reading has reached this state now where we can really apply the science to facilitate reading acquisition. I'll just finish by some more general conclusions about the science of learning. I hope you see that neuroscience is not really irrelevant for education. It helps a lot to understand what the brain does. And the brain is a highly structured organ with considerable plasticity from the side. So it has both an innate component and a learning component. Basically, it's a supercomputer. And if we think of the baby as a supercomputer, without any match in current AI, I don't think AI is matching what the baby is doing, where we really need to feed this supercomputer with a well-designed curriculum and explicit teaching, the best structured teaching that we can give to this computer rather than leave it to just discovery learning. I think that there is a lot of scientific principles that we already have that can help in education, the knowledge of the brain's learning algorithms, many experiments that test what pedagogies work best, such as the one I just showed you, but also acceptance of the results. What I told you about phonics, I think we know for more than 30 years now. 30 years. Why isn't this more accepted? I don't know. I think it's really time to face the science. And I will just conclude with this word. The whole language method is totally unacceptable. It was already 30 years ago. It's even more today, given the science of the brain that I just showed you. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. I don't know if I can hear you. I went a little bit over time. Sorry for that.
No worries, Stan. Thanks a lot for your beautiful talk. I think there's time for 1 or 2 quick questions from the audience. Yeah, I see one there. Let's see first whether, well, you go on and then we see whether Stan can hear you.
Is that working? Yes.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, good.
That was totally fascinating. And I'm just really interested in phonics and its long-term effect on children's reading. Have there been any studies done on how phonics impacts on children's reading beyond the stage when they're doing the learning? Because I've heard some teachers say that phonics has a negative effect on their motivation to read and to become readers and people who enjoy reading. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, but I don't know anything about this really. I have not seen any evidence like this. I know it's something that teachers say. They would like to teach comprehension right away. And for all we know, it's not the proper attitude. The comprehension will come once you are able to decipher. But you cannot skip that step of learning to decode. Of course, you're not finished with learning to read when you've learned to decode. As I said, you need to automatize, but of course you also need to learn a lot of vocabulary. Vocabulary learning is occurring throughout childhood and of course even through adulthood. So teaching comprehension should not be seen as an alternative to teaching decoding. Both are needed, but the timescales are completely different. The timing of comprehension learning starts from birth and goes on and on throughout the whole of school, basically. But the timing of decoding is very different. We need to give the key, basically. And I don't know of any adverse effects. It's not true, for instance, that children who learn to decode understand less well. All of the statistics that we have suggest that they understand better, which makes a lot of sense because it's a necessary step, basically, for learning to read.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? Yeah, it's there in the middle of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. I wonder if you are, in your research, having connection with people researching in typography, typefaces, the design of the signs, typography research.
Yeah, thanks. That's a lovely question. I read a lot about that, but I haven't done directly research about it, but I speak a lot in this book, Reading in the Brain, because I think that it's a beautiful study of co-evolution between learning in the brain and cultural evolution. We have selected for the science of our writing system little shapes that are easy to recognize by the brain. And so it's part of this nice story about recycling of brain abilities. In fact, if you record from the brains of monkeys, who of course cannot read, you already find neurons that care about letters. How could that be? It's very weird, right? Well, monkey brains already care about the presence of, for instance, of a T shape, a T junction like this. If there is one object behind another, like this perhaps, how can I do this? Like this, right? Okay, so my hand is behind the other, that creates a little T junction here. The visual system is already attuned to this sort of properties, and we have recycled these neurons by selecting the shapes of letters that are easy to recognize by the visual system of all primates, basically. So it's not just an arbitrary system, and typography is indeed very carefully selected letters that can be easily discriminated and so on. Unfortunately, it's not perfect because nobody really cared so much about that. It's all been sort of evolution. So we can still improve our cultural systems, and we can design slightly better systems that may perhaps fit better with our brain. So I discuss a lot, I didn't have time to discuss that today, but the case of mirror letters, P's and Q's and B's and D's, they create problems for all children, by the way, not just for dyslexics. There's nothing to do with dyslexia. They create problems because our visual system treats them as the same object, because that's a hand, and that's also a hand. So mirror image recognition is built in our visual system, and that creates problems for letters like P and Q and B and D. So there is a lot to say about whether we could design slightly better systems for reading, but already cultural evolution has made them pretty efficient, and learning does the rest. I'm interested in this topic in all sorts of respects. It's not just learning to read, but also learning numbers is capitalizing our pre-existing abilities to recognize numbers of objects in the external world, which is again present not just in humans, but also in other primates and many other animals. And recently I've become very interested in the design of graphics, and that will be my next book. The design of graphics is also a very wonderful way in which we've used and reused our visual system and trying to design things better so we can grasp in one glance what's happening in data, for instance. So in all of these cases, there is recycling of the brain's pre-existing ability.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I know there's many hands, but I think we have to move on with the program, otherwise we're going to be a little bit too much over time. So thanks a lot for the questions you had for Stan. Thanks a lot to Stan for the great talk. I hope you can hear the clap.